Hi there, I'm Hayley Armstrong, educational psychologist. Thank you very much for signing up to this Q1 taster course today on exam anxiety. So for an overview of the session today, we'll be talking about some of the signs and triggers of exam anxiety. I'll be talking a little bit around the impact of motivation on exam anxiety. And at the end of the presentation, I'll be discussing a few practical strategies to help students to manage their levels of anxiety, to help them with revision skills and support them to maintain a healthy lifestyle during exams. It's useful to stop and think back about the time when we were all sitting exams and think about some of the things that might have made you feel a little bit anxious or a bit nervous during that time. There's a difference between feeling nervous during exams because some stress and some anxiety is healthy for us and helps us to perform. It's when anxiety becomes overbearing or too much that we need to have a look at how to support this. But it's useful just to think about some of the factors involved. So pause the presentation now and just have a think, when you were sitting exams, what were some of the things that made you feel anxious? So these are the 4 factors within the research that have been found to be really important in terms of exam anxiety. So the first one being consequences. So it's that feeling that your grades or the outcomes of exams are going to have educational or occupational consequences. So, for example, I must get 5 GCSE grades to be able to go to college, or I must be able to get a certain number of grades or a high grade in my A-levels to be able to go on and do this future career that I want to do. Markers of self-esteem have also found to be important. So this is where students will judge their worth based on the grades that they have, particularly with the view that good grades therefore results in higher self-esteem. There's also the notion of judgment that's been found to be really important in terms of exam anxiety. And if you think about a student or child's context or their ecosystem, it could be judgment from themselves, as we've discussed in terms of impact on self-esteem. It could be judgment from peers, judgment from parents, judgment from schools, or just judgment from wider society in terms of what grades you might have and therefore what job you have in the future. And interestingly, fear appeals have been found to be particularly important in terms of exam anxiety within the research, and often it's fear appeals from schools. So it's often the well-intentioned pressure that is placed upon students, such as if you don't study hard, you're not going to be able to pass your exams, or if you don't listen, you're not going to get the grades that you're wanting. So even though it is well-intentioned, and it's designed to be a motivational strategy a lot of the time as well, for some students it creates disproportionate amounts of stress and can feed into exam anxiety. In the current climate that we're all in with the COVID-19 pandemic, it's particularly useful just to sit and reflect about students at the moment who have either been preparing for exams to find that they're not sitting them, or particularly at the moment students who are perhaps, for example, in year groups like year 10, where they know their GCSEs are on the horizon, but they don't quite know how they're going to be taking their exams, what format that might be in, or whether they're going to have enough time to prepare for them with being out of school for so long. And it's useful just to wonder about what the impact on exam anxiety might be for those students. So again, if you just want to pause and just take a moment to reflect and think about some of the things that they might be thinking and feeling at the moment. Okay, so it's useful to define exam anxiety. So within the literature, exam anxiety has been defined as an unpleasant feeling or emotional state that has physiological and behavioural concomitants. That's a word I've tried to practice pronouncing as well, and that is experienced in formal testing or other evaluative situations. What really strikes me about this description is the link between feelings and emotions, physiology and behaviour. So this link between emotions, physiology and behaviour is something that's useful just to keep in mind, because we're going to be reflecting on this as we move throughout the presentation. So as an activity here, I just want you to pause the presentation again and just have a think about these different areas and think about anxiety more broadly. So what are some of the signs of anxiety? What are some of the emotions that you might be feeling? What are some of the behaviours that you may be seeing? What are some of the thoughts that you might be having? And what might your body be doing? What are those physiological responses? So starting with emotional, that might be feelings such as disappointment, worry, anger, depression. It could be a range of different emotions that come into feelings of anxiety. On the flip side, it could be unexpected emotional responses as well, such as almost feelings of hysteria in a sense, so uncontrollable laughing, or the opposite, uncontrollable crying. So again, if sometimes when we're working with students with anxiety, those kind of responses can be quite deceiving in a sense and doesn't always signpost anxiety to us. But some of the responses that you may see, such as smirking, grinning, laughing, they can all be signs of anxiety. Examples of behavioural responses could include things like fidgeting, pacing, and particularly relevant for exam anxiety are avoidance behaviours. You may see students engaging in less helpful coping strategies as well, so that could be avoiding speaking to friends or to family, or it could even include things like substance abuse, so starting to consume alcohol more heavily, for example. The impact on cognition and thoughts, it could be that you're feeling like you've got a racing mind, or the opposite and just going blank. It could be difficulties concentrating, negative self-talk. It could also include comparing yourself to other people, and having difficulty in organising your thoughts. Physiological symptoms of anxiety are those things that you feel within your body. So it could be a racing heart, it could be sweating, it could be frequently things such as stomach aches or nausea. So these are some of the signs that you may expect when someone is feeling particularly anxious. So now we've had a think about the different signs of anxiety in those 4 areas, it's useful to have a look at this model, which is called the hot cross bun model. And this is based on cognitive behavioural psychology, sometimes known as cognitive behavioural therapy, so CBT. And this discusses how your thoughts, feelings, behaviour and physiology all link together, so one state can interact on the other. And this slide provides an example of how this might look in terms of exam anxiety. So if we work anti-clockwise, for example, students' thought might be, I'm going to fail. So it might be very negative self-talk. So I've not revised, I'm going to fail. Therefore, the feelings they may be experiencing is feeling worried, feeling scared, again, feeling disappointed. This therefore may lead to physical symptoms such as shaking, sweating, starting to feel sick, and may also affect things like their sleep, for example. And this can then impact on their behaviour as well. So students try and make themselves then feel as well as they can do in a situation by engaging in unhelpful coping strategies, which might involve avoiding revision, avoiding social connection with others and speaking to others about how they're feeling. This then again feeds back into all the different elements as well. So if they're avoiding revision, they're feeling unprepared, and again, it moves back to that thought of, I'm going to fail. So this model quite nicely highlights how all of these different elements interact, and also can maintain some of the more unhelpful feelings or thoughts or behaviours. So we've briefly covered a bit around anxiety and how that can manifest and what some of the signs are for anxiety. So we're just going to touch on motivation now. So first of all, what's meant by motivation? So literature again describes motivation as enthusiasm for doing something and the need or reason for doing something. So I've put in bold the enthusiasm and need and reason, and I've underlined the doing something because again, it's that interaction between internal states and behaviours, the actions that you see. When considering motivation, it's important to have a think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and I know a lot of people have come across this before. So at the bottom of the triangle are the physiological needs that everyone needs at a basic level, so food, water, warmth and rest, gradually moving up towards psychological needs, and at the very top, self-fulfillment needs. Maslow says that you can't achieve the top part of the triangle without achieving the lower levels. So right at the top, you can see there is self-actualization. So that's achieving one's full potential, including creative activities. So again, if you think of this in terms of exams and possibly achieving one's full potential, maybe a student achieving the grades that they want to get in terms of exams. However, when you think about exams and revision and the pressures on students, I wonder how many of the bottom level, in terms of the basic needs, tend to go out of the window. So making sure that you're eating healthily enough, making sure that you get enough sleep. Particularly even then moving up in psychological needs as well, so belongingness and love needs, how much effort or maintenance are you putting into your social relationships at that time? So it's worth just having a reflect on that and seeing how easily we can lose some of these things during exams. And I'm just going to touch on self-determination theory here, because this is crucial within motivation. So this is a theory that stipulates that individuals have an intrinsic tendency to strive towards goals and growth and to resolve internal inconsistency. So it's that innate nature that humans strive towards where they want to get to. So important components of self-determination theory, there are three of them. So there's autonomy, so that's the individual's need to exercise choice and to feel in control of their destiny and in terms of what happens. There's perceived competence, so the need to feel competent and confident about one's own abilities. And there's relatedness, so that need to be connected and involved with others. So intrinsically motivated learning has been found to be one of the earliest and most useful types of motivation. Intrinsic motivation talks about wanting to achieve things, again, for one's own belief in their abilities, rather than external motivation, which is based upon performing an action or doing something in order to achieve something external, such as a reward or, for example, payment for a job. And again, at this point, it would be useful just to pause and reflect upon how well your school, in your opinion, fosters intrinsic motivation, and how do we help pupils to become autonomous and to be able to make their own choices. And similar to the previous slide as well, it's interesting to consider these three key components in self-determination theory and think about how much of this we feel during exams. So, for example, that feeling of being in control of what happens, how much of that can you do really when you don't know what the exam paper is going to be, what the questions might be? Perceived competence, how confident and competent do we feel during these times? Often exams are a test of this for us. And again, that relatedness, the need to be involved with others. We often are quite solitary when we're revising by ourselves or thinking about exams. So again, you can see where motivation might be a difficulty. And how, again, that can then feed into exam anxiety. And again, just to touch upon the point of intrinsic motivation, it's useful just to know about the different categories of motivation. So it's separated into three categories: intrinsic, extrinsic, and amotivation. So the most self-determined type of learners are those who experience intrinsic motivation. And that's where learners are engaged in an activity because of its fun, attraction, or interest. Research has shown that this is a positive predictor of attempting challenging tasks and in terms of the amount of concentration and effort students put into their learning. Again, as touched upon previously, extrinsic motivation is then either engaging in an activity in order to obtain a reward or to avoid a threat or punishment. And amotivation is the feeling of not having motivation towards a task at all. Both external motivation and amotivation are positive predictors of boredom often. So it really is thinking about a school context, is fostering intrinsic motivation that's going to be most important for learners. And that therefore has a positive knock-on impact as well for exam anxiety. One of the techniques and practical activities we can use to foster intrinsic motivation is called the staircase to success. So the staircase of success helps students to think about what their long-term personal goals are and breaks it down in smaller goals to help them think about what they can do to experience success. This is likely to be really personalised for each student and isn't an activity which is designed to put pressure on students but support them to very much reach their own goals. So you could practice this own activity as I talk through it. So at the very top, you will write down a long-term goal. So for students, with supporting them with exam anxiety, it may be linked to future career aspirations or to the exams themselves. What you'll do after this is ask them something that's called the miracle question, which can feel quite tricky and strange at first in the way that it's phrased. So you would ask the student to imagine that a miracle has happened overnight while they've been asleep, and they've woken up the next morning and their goal has been achieved. You would then ask the student questions such as, how will they know their goal has been achieved? Who would notice? What will be different? And that's just to gain a really clear and explicit view of what the student's goal would look like and what life would be like for them if they had achieved their goal. You would then ask the student to jot down some ideas at the bottom of this sheet. So you could print off a copy of this for them And right at the bottom, they'll think about how will I know I've achieved my goal? What will it look like and what will it feel like? And this again can just aid motivation. We'd now think about asking the student to break their goal down into smaller steps. So it could be ideally 5 steps, but it can be less than that if needed. It can be differentiated for the particular student. Ideally, step 1 might be something that they've already done. So, for example, it might be that they've been able to start doing some exam revision. So whatever it looks like for that student, and this might need a lot of help in terms of breaking this down for them, but it can just help their long-term goal to feel a lot more manageable. Once the students have done this, it's useful then to ask them to reflect on whether there's any difficulties or barriers that they're likely to encounter, and just jot those down as well. And if they experience these barriers, it's useful to help students just reflect on who can help me in this situation, or what kind of help might I need, just to make sure that students are aware that they can seek support from other people and that they don't have to do everything by themselves. So this is just a really nice way of fostering motivation, and again, just helping with exam anxiety, because it's breaking what can feel like sometimes an unmanageable goal into smaller, more achievable steps. So on the next slide is growth mindsets, which is quite a popular concept at the moment, and it's around reframing adversities. So on a very basic level, reframing the can't into can. So this slide here gives you some examples. Instead of avoiding challenges, it's embracing them. Instead of giving up when you face obstacles, it's persevering. Growth mindsets can be embedded within school in a number of ways. So there's an example of a whole school display, which I'll show you on the next page. But it can also be used and embedded within classroom practice. So, for example, reframing your own mindset to help students, or adapting the language that you're using to help reframe some of the things that students are saying and some of their perceptions. You can also take time to talk about learning and to reflect upon this, and help students to teach them metacognitive strategies too, which I will link at the end. Helping to normalise mistakes and failure as well can be quite helpful for students, and just making sure that students are aware that mistakes can be helpful for learning and that we all make mistakes, just to again help to reframe some of their perceptions and reduce feelings of anxiety. And on this slide is an example of a whole class display that's been used. So just to provide an overview of some of the strategies and approaches to help students manage their levels of anxiety during exams, we can help them by helping children to develop a positive self-concept and safely challenge any negative thinking. And that might be through cognitive behavioural approaches such as the hot cross bun, reframing thoughts. There's nice worksheets online called thinking traps, which help students to recognise when they're starting to slip into particular traps in terms of negative self-talk. There's also resources you can buy in, such as Think Good, Feel Good by Paul Stallard as well. We can help children to start to recognise their emotions and help them self-regulate as well. So that might be through relaxation techniques such as mindfulness, breathing exercises, progressive muscle relaxation. It may be through more intervention style techniques to promote self-regulation, such as 5-point scales. We could also encourage students as well to keep a diary of exam worries too, and start to help them to recognise their thoughts, feelings, behaviours and physiological responses. We can try and build in a sense of routine and predictability to help children feel safe during this time, and encourage children to keep to quite tight routines at home as well, just to make sure that they're looking after themselves. And again, it gives them that sense of structure and knowing what to expect. Sharing our own experiences of how we interpreted exams when we were younger and some of the feelings that we held can be really useful in terms of helping to normalise some of the feelings that our students are having as well. Just knowing that other people have felt this way and that they're not the only ones can be really helpful. Encouraging students to continue to seek social support as well from peers or from family members or from teachers is really important during this time of what's quite high stress for a lot of students as well. And then finally, it's important for us to support children to develop their levels of resilience. There's lots of information about this online. If you would Google, it's called the Boing Boing framework. That's Boing, so Boing Boing by Angie Hart. There's a really nice grid on there which shows some of the things that we can look at in terms of helping children to develop their levels of resilience. So we've talked about strategies to help children to manage their levels of anxiety through emotional means. It's also useful just to have a quick think about practical strategies to help children to revise as well, because that can then in turn lower levels of exam anxiety. So some techniques might be active reading. There's a particular active reading technique that I cover in the main presentation called SQ3R. So if you're interested in that, that will be in the longer version of this training. There are memory strategies that can be used, such as chunking or mnemonics, to make it helpful and easier for children and young people to retain information. There are revision tips that can be used. So BBC Bite Size has quite a lot of useful information around revision tips. And that website also has a lot of information about helping children and young people to manage their time. And just briefly before the end, we'll cover the Healthy Mind Platter, which is by Dan Siegel. So this talks about the different types of time that we need in order to, I suppose, feel at our best, really. So sleep time helps our brain to recover from some of the experiences of the day. Physical time relates to things like exercise and moving our bodies in positive ways. Focus time refers to focusing on tasks in a goal-oriented way. Playtime refers to some of our hobbies and being able to connect with things in a creative or enjoyable way. Connecting time is one that's really important and really difficult in the current climate that we're in. But connecting time talks about us connecting with other people and also even to nature and the environment around us. Downtime is almost the opposite to focus time, and it's not having any kind of goals or activities or focus at that time, it's just letting ourselves be. And time in refers to us reflecting internally, so thinking again about our thoughts, our feelings, our emotions, those internal states. So this model is useful to think about with students as well, and to encourage them to make sure that they're meeting all of these, I suppose, or incorporating all of these different times for themselves, particularly during times of exams or high stress. And again, it's useful maybe just to pause the presentation here and just think about how many of these we're meeting for ourselves at the moment. And if we're able to meet them quite well, what things are we doing that's really strong in terms of being able to provide these different times for ourselves. So we've come to the end, so just to sum up, so feelings of exam anxiety is normal, and we all need a certain level of anxiety to perform well, but too much of it can be debilitating for us and actually hinder our performance. It's also important to consider a number of factors and approaches to reduce exam anxiety, so thinking about coping strategies and the emotional side of things, thinking about how to promote motivation, thinking about how to revise effectively, and also how to maintain a healthy lifestyle during times of stress. And something that's really important to mention in terms of exam anxiety, and is fairly unique to this really, so all children and young people experience exams in different ways, but it's often students who we may not have other concerns about. So it could be students who are high achievers or are perfectionists actually experience exam anxiety more profoundly than other students may do. And this makes early identification of these students really difficult as well, because sometimes the anxiety won't manifest itself until we get to periods of high stress, such as during exams as well. So it's very difficult to pick up on these students earlier. So a useful thing to do would be to look at whole class or whole school approaches to managing exam anxiety to make sure that support's there from an early stage for all students. We have come to the end of the presentation, so thank you so much for listening to this. If there's anything that you do find interesting within the full 3-hour presentation, I'll be covering this in a lot more detail and talking about strategies in more depth as well. So please do feel free to sign up to this. If there are any questions or comments, please feel free to get in touch with myself. So my email address is hayley.armstrong@bradford.gov.uk. And at the end of this presentation, I've just got a reference list here of things that may be useful to look at. So thank you very much.